this question of what was it that I got wrong about Christianity, coming here, I mean, literally in person, not on Zoom, which I thought I was going to be doing until about 11 o'clock this morning. So it was a very dramatic rush up here. It brings me full circle, really, because I think, Justin, I'm right in saying that what first inspired you to get in touch with me was that I wrote an article in the New Statesman, a magazine here in Britain, and I'd been asked, among a number of people, to write about something that I'd got wrong, that I'd changed my mind about. And I chose to write about Christianity, that all the things that I felt that I'd got wrong about Christianity. And it was on the back of that you invited me here, and I think had my first discussion with Larry Hurtado, the late great Larry Hurtado. So forgive me, those of you who may conceivably remember that conversation, if I repeat myself. I know some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, some of you may have heard before, but please forgive me. And essentially, to answer the question of what I got wrong about Christianity requires me to venture back into what Tom Wright, in his talk, referred to as the mishmash of memories, that people who may not entirely have a handle on Christianity, it tends to be the kind of sludge of memory that accumulated in childhood and which kind of drifts around in the back of the brain. And for a long time, that was, I guess, what I had. And those memories, I think, are absolutely formative. When I look back, I realise that essentially they shaped my attitude to Christianity very, very profoundly, and they were not in any way negative memories. I think it's possible that my mother may be out there, and if she is, I just want to reassure you, Ma, that you were a wonderful example of Christianity to me. You raised me in the Anglican Church, you took me to church, you obliged me to sing in the choir, which may have been a terrible mistake, actually. That was maybe the one thing you got wrong. You made me go to Sunday school, and of course you introduced me to my wonderful godmother, Deb Gillingham, who is no longer with us, but who, again, provided an absolute kind of model of the best that a Christian life could be. And she was incredibly kind, incredibly generous. And like a good godmother, she gave me all kinds of reading material on Christianity, on the Bible in particular. And I still have those books, and they are still completely vivid in my mind. Children's illustrated Bibles. In due course, David Kossoff's wonderful retelling of, well, I was about to say the Old Testament, but of course for David Kossoff, the Hebrew Scriptures. And they gave, the theme today is the greatest story ever told. They gave me a sense of the Bible as the greatest story ever told. They gave me a sense particularly of the Old Testament as a collection of absolutely amazing narratives. But when I look back and I think, what was it that grabbed me? What I remember, above all, it's not the children of Israel. It's not really Moses or the prophets. It's the big bad guys. So it's Pharaoh. It's Pharaoh and his sumptuous cities, the great idols, the pyramids as they appeared in the illustrations, his army of chariots plunging into the Red Sea. And if I'm honest, the faint feeling of regret I felt when the waves came tumbling down and they were washed away, and I was left in the company of the children of Israel for the next 40 years. Then, of course, we have the invasion of Canaan. Once again, my heart thrilled to the spectacle of bloodshed and slaughter, the fall of the walls of Jericho, all the incredible stories that surrounded that. And then in due course, the cycle of great empires that emerged over the course of the Old Testament story, Assyria, Babylon. Again, when I look back at my memory, amazing illustrations of the city of Babylon, the glamour, the great, again, kind of step temples, the idols, the gold, the blues. And then we got to Rome with the New Testament. And again, every time in the illustration, a platoon of Roman soldiers, centurions, Pontius Pilate, and then in due course, probably the very first book of the Bible that I actually read, I was inspired by the account of Revelation and the whore of Babylon, that just seemed the most thrilling thing imaginable. And I would read about the Whore of Babylon and discover that this was actually a portrait of Rome. In fact, I now recognise probably the first great work of overtly anti-imperial literature ever written. But again, I'm ashamed to say that it was the glamour of Rome, the ferocity of Rome, the kind of terrifying beauty of Rome that grabbed me far more, I'm ashamed to say, than the details of Christ's life, let alone the Acts of the Apostle or Paul's letters, which wasn't interested in them at all. I just wanted whores of Babylon and Roman soldiers and that kind of thing. So you can see that I was a kind of, I guess, a horrible little boy, really. Not at all interested in the things that I should have been. And I remember at Sunday school, again, had a wonderful teacher, and there was an illustrated Bible there that I got to read. And the very first page, it showed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, surrounded by kind of parrots and snakes and zebras and leopards and a brachiosaur. And you can imagine, if I was the kind of boy who was interested in the glamour and the savagery and the cruelty of ancient empires, then I was definitely the kind of boy who was into dinosaurs. And I knew absolutely that dinosaurs and humans had not coexisted. And I asked my Sunday school teacher what was going on, and she tried to negotiate this, and I wasn't convinced. And for the first time, I think a kind of little shiver of Alice Roberts entered my heart, a slight sense of doubt. So one of the things that emerged from my Christian education, I absolutely had a familiarity with the Bible, a deep respect for the Christian example set above all by my mother and by my godmother, but also a sense that I found, I guess, the historic enemies of Israel, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Romans, to be more exciting than the children of Israel themselves. And also just a faint shadow of doubt that had kind of been generated by my interest in prehistory, my interest in paleontology. I guess a kind of precocious Victorian sense of doubt, a kind of religious crisis, a Darwinian shiver of anxiety about how the biblical story, and particularly Genesis, was to be melded and mapped with the biblical account. And the truth is that, I guess, kind of going into my teens, these various doubts kind of grew. So I was confirmed into the Church of England, and as I was confirmed, I believed it. But the truth is that over my teenage years, my interest in the classical world, in the world of Greece and Rome in particular, came completely to blot out my interest in Christianity. And I would visualize them almost kind of synesthetically. So when I thought of Greece or of Rome, I would see great temples against clear blue skies, a kind of wondrous Mediterranean beauty. And then when I thought of Christianity, I would think of kind of driving autumnal rain and monks shivering in unattractive clothing with guttering candles as the wind howled and screamed. All completely unfair, of course, but the mind plays strange tricks, and this sense, I suppose, was given intellectual ballast for me by two authors that I read. The first one was Edward Gibbon, his great account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which is a kind of magisterial, seminal account of how the greatest empire on the face of the earth imploded completely. And in Gibbon's opinion, one of the major contributory factors to the fall of the Roman Empire was the rise of Christianity. And as Byron said of him, he sapped a solemn creed with solemn sneer. And there was this kind of tone of mockery about it that I found simultaneously kind of shocking, but also quite exciting. And then in due course, I read probably the greatest atheist author of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's argument was a kind of refinement of Gibbon's argument, not just that Christianity was ridiculous, but that it was actively pernicious. And what Nietzsche wanted was to return to the world of power that Greece and Rome had represented. Nietzsche, I think, as profoundly as anyone since Paul has done, recognised the scandal, as Tom Wright, quoting Paul, said, and the ludicrous quality of it. The idea that a god could have suffered such a fate, the paradigmatic fate of a slave, the most monstrous, unimaginable death. How was this possible? And for Nietzsche, this showed how ludicrous it was, that it had created a world in which suffering was valorized, in which the weak and the poor, and as Nietzsche saw it, the contemptible, were given status by virtue of their suffering, and the strong and the powerful, the Caesars, the Babylonian kings, the Nebuchadnezzars, the pharaohs, they were as nothing compared to people who had suffered death on instruments of torture. And so, going into my adult life, deciding that I wanted to write history, I turned to these worlds that had so sparked and fired my imagination as a child and as a teenager. And my first book was about the Rome of Julius Caesar. My second book was about the Greeks that fought at Marathon, at Salamis, and perhaps above all at Thermopylae, so the Spartans. And these had been my heroes as a child. But I found the process of having to live in their minds for years and years at a time, I discovered I didn't actually like them very much. I kind of admired them in the way that I would admire a tyrannosaur, but just as you don't want to live in a house with a tyrannosaur. So I began to find it quite a strain living alongside these frankly terrifying figures. Julius Caesar, this remarkable man whose name to this day remains a byword for power, who ended up pulling down the entire structure, the ancient structure of the Roman republican system. He made his name, he won his power, he got his legions, he got his money, essentially by conquering the Gauls. And that process of conquest was a brutal one, utterly brutal, potentially genocidal. It's said of him that he slaughtered 1 million Gauls, enslaved another. And what I found shocking about this was not just that he'd done it, you expect great conquerors to kill and to enslave, but that this was regarded as a feather in his cap. This was something to exult in. This was something that helped make his name, that made him a byword. And likewise, reading about Leonidas, the Spartan king, those of you who've seen 300 will recognize it in his tight speedos, fighting off orcs and carnivorous rhinoceros and things. That's not actually what happened. But it was actually, I realized reading the accounts of Leonidas, this heroic defense against, as Herodotus, the Greek historian, says, 1 million Persians, again an exaggeration, but clearly a massively heroic figure who sacrificed himself for the good of his people. And yet the entire Spartan system was founded on the most brutal oppression of a conquered people who were deliberately demeaned, who were literally bred to be as stultish and slavish as possible. And again, I began to realize these people are terrifying. And the illusion that I'd had, that I was in some sense a kind of descendant of classical antiquity, the sense that I had inherited from Gibbon, I began to realize that was ludicrous, that the sense that Gibbon had propagated, that antiquity had been an age of sunshine, and then there had been a dark age, and it had remained dark until the Enlightenment had come in the 18th century, and all once again had been light. That this was this was a wholly bogus way of representing the course of history. And I began to realize as well, and to contemplate the fact that Nietzsche's praise of the strength and the power and the ferocity of classical civilization had led, as Nietzsche himself, of course, did not realize, that it had led to many of the horrors that stained the central years of the past century. That in a sense, the lauding of the strong, the insistence that the weak should be crushed, should not be permitted to stand in the way of the powerful, had fed directly into fascism and in the long run into the monstrous crimes committed by the Nazis. And so I began to feel that I was going to have to very radically recalibrate my sense of where I'd come from and what it was that had shaped my kind of moral sense, my sense of what was right, and explain why it was that I, rather than thrilling to what Caesar and Leonidas had done, that I was starting to find myself vaguely repulsed by them. And the process of discovering what it was that had shaped me and the world that I live in was sharpened for me by going on to write a book about the period called Late Antiquity, so the kind of the late Roman period leading into the emergence of the Islamic empires, the Caliphate. And that required me to think, to research, to write quite a lot about Islam. And I've ended up kind of basically for almost 5 years, it seemed, reading, debating, talking about Islam. And that again sharpened for me the sense of what was distinctive about my beliefs. And I began to realize that actually I was actually very, very profoundly Christian. And that sense was sharpened for me by studying the Greeks and the Romans, by studying Islam. And it was particularly focused for me by one question that I was asked when I was doing an event on the back of the book on Islam, where a Muslim in the audience said, in your book, you question some of the fundamentals of Muslim belief. You question who Muhammad was. You question where the Quran was. You imply that much of what we Muslims believe about our faith is not true. Why have you done this? You would never do this about your own beliefs. And I felt there was an incredible force to that, because I was standing there before her as a humanist, as an agnostic, as a secularist. And I was already coming to realize that I did not believe in the myths of humanism and liberalism. Or rather, I had begun to realize that these myths were simply twigs off the great branch that was in turn off the great tree of Christianity. And so when I wrote the article in The New Statesman, and then when I went on to write my book, Dominion, which was really an elaboration of that, I wanted to essentially put my hands up and say, yes, I got Christianity wrong. Because in fact, I think that not just me, but the whole of the West, in the most fundamental ways, is so shot through with Christian assumptions, with Christian attitudes, that even today, when people may not be going to church, may not believe in God, that very lack of belief in God may itself be completely shaped by Christian evolution. And that when, for instance, Alice Roberts doubts, reminds people that dead people do not rise from the dead, that is an attitude of skepticism towards the supernatural that is present in the Hebrew prophets. The Hebrew prophets were turning round to the kings of Egypt and Babylon and Assyria and saying, your gods are nonsensical, your gods are merely stock and stone. And that's an attitude that the Christian missionaries in the early Middle Ages inherited. It's an attitude that the Protestant reformers in their attitudes towards the medieval church inherited. And it's an attitude that Gibbon and his fellow philosophes in the Enlightenment herited and passed down to the modern generation of humanists. In other words, when people talk of people like Richard Dawkins as evangelical, that's exactly what they are. They are talking of banishing superstition, of toppling idols, of bringing people who walked in darkness into light. And why do they feel it's so important to talk about this? Because by talking about it, they say they will save people, they will redeem people. And it's to that extent that I began to realize that even when I was at my most skeptical, my most full of doubt about Christianity, even then, I was still being Christian. And so that's why I am very, very happy, 4 years on from writing the New Statesman article. Well, actually, no, it's 5, isn't it? Goodness, time does fly. Very, very happy to stand up here again and put my hands up and say, yes, I got absolutely loads wrong about Christianity. And the thing that I got most wrong about Christianity was ever to believe that I wasn't Christian. The
first comment that a lot of people are saying in the chat is, you're a born preacher, Tom. So,
well, I'm too an evangelist.
So maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to do a bit of that as well at some point. But let's start with, I mean, her name's come up an awful lot already, but Alice Roberts, who isn't here to defend herself. But if you are watching at some point later somehow, Alice, I would love to have you on my show. And perhaps we could get you in a conversation with either of our Toms or someone else. But one of the questions was in regard to that exactly. I'm just going to slot down to it. Here we go. Tom, what do you think is the most effective Christian response to someone like Alice Roberts? This is from Richard, by the way, and others like her who essentially are poo-pooing the Christian story and saying, that sort of thing. And Richard says she seems blissfully unaware that she articulates a thoroughly Christian worldview in general on human rights, standing up for the weak, international law, etc. But where do you begin in that kind of a conversation with someone?
Well, I'm not really qualified to say what would be the best way to convert Alice Roberts to Christianity. I mean, I don't feel that I'm in the business of doing that. But I would say that, Alice Roberts, her position, I mean, she is coming to it from a kind of self-avowed sceptical position. Mm-hmm. And as I've just said, I would say that that in a sense, the brand of scepticism that she embodies is a brand of scepticism that, ironically enough, can be traced back to Isaiah and to Jeremiah. And I would say that to most atheists who would define themselves as being atheists because of their enthusiasm for evolution, I would say, well, from what have your beliefs, what's the path of evolution that your beliefs have come from? Because, I mentioned Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the greatest atheist because he stares into the fact that humanist values, liberal values, whatever we want to call them, are essentially Christian values. And he was particularly contemptuous of this trend in the English. He was withering about the way in which English intellectuals, and I think he was particularly thinking of George Eliot, were terribly prone to basically kind of sucking out all the liberal stuff from Christianity, keeping it for themselves, and then kind of claiming not to be Christian. And Nietzsche regarded this with the utmost contempt. And I think there's a kind of, that sense of contempt to a degree is earned, because I think that, it doesn't invalidate liberal opinion to recognise where it comes from. But I don't see what the problem is for liberals or agnostics or humanists or secularists to recognise, what the line of dissent is. Right. I simply don't see what the issue is there. And yet the sheer militancy and kind of hostility suggests that there is something very, very deep there. Yeah. You don't have to be Freud to recognise that when you're getting angry about something, there's something being suppressed.
Well, let's hear from Aldo now. Similar question, and I've got a bit of a follow-on to it. Aldo says a lot of people, though, do say that the moral compass of Western culture does not come from Christianity. And how do you respond to that? And I'll give you an example. Okay, in this very studio, I did one of my big conversations with Steven Pinker as one of the people involved, and he's written this book in which he says we're
progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at how much progress we're doing, and we're increasingly doing it in a sort of post-Christian West, and it was just happened to be Christian. But I said, well, where what is it? He said, science and reason. That's what's driving us forward. And I said, what is it about the science and the reason that's doing that? He said, well, I said, when it comes to this belief that we all have inherent equality and dignity, where did that come from? And he said, well, science tells us we're all made from the same stuff, therefore we should treat each other the same way. That was his argument in a nutshell. So why, for you, does that sort of science argument not fly?
Well, let's go back to the Nazis. The reason that the Nazis were the most absolute enemies of the Christian Revolution is not because they targeted the institutional churches in the way that, say, the French revolutionaries did, or particularly the Russian revolutionaries did. The Nazis were happy to allow both the Protestant and the Catholic churches a kind of wraith-like existence. But what the Nazis did in a way that the French and the Russian revolutionaries did not do was to target the key fundamentals of Christian teaching, of which two are very obvious. and Tom mentioned them in his talk. One is precisely the humanist idea, the idea that we are all created equally in the image of God. In the Pauline formulation of it, that there is no Jew or Greek. The Nazis obviously thought that Jews and Greeks were fundamentally different, and they couched that in scientific terms. They were very keen not just on being racist, but on being scientifically racist. And they drew on the inheritance of Darwinism to justify that. Likewise, they drew on the inheritance of Darwinism, and specifically of eugenics, to repudiate another fundamental Christian idea, which is the one that I was talking about in reference to Nietzsche, which is the idea that the strong have a duty of care to the weak, and that if that's true, then the weak kind of, they have rights. Those who are hungry, those who are starving, those who are sick have the right to be looked after. Again, this is something that the Nazis decisively rejected. Hitler was contemptuous of the idea that resources could be going on those who he saw as being mentally or physically not worthy of being allowed continued life, when this could be going on funding healthy, strapping Germans who would deserve and profit from it much better. And Hitler couched this in explicitly scientific terms. He says, he talks about the survival of the fittest, which was a phrase coined by Darwin's cousin, and had, through the Nazi period, become synonymous with that understanding of how nature operated. Now, it seems to me that science, in that sense, is a mirror that is held up to the values of the society that is holding up that mirror. If the Nazis had won, if we'd been brought up in a fascist state, I suspect that the science that we learnt would teach us that fascism was right. We've grown up in a liberal order, so the science teaches us that liberalism is right. I don't think that science in itself supports any such notion. I think, as I say, I think science is a mirror. So if you are if you're a believer in progress, you're going to believe that science tells you that progress is a good thing. But essentially, where does the idea of progress come from? It's a deeply Christian one. The Greeks, the Romans had no sense of progress whatsoever. They viewed change as a fundamentally bad thing. Res novae in Latin essentially meant some terrible things that happen, kind of revolutionary things, stop them. So I think that Steven Pinker thinks that science teaches that progress is right because he already thinks that. And why does he already think that? I think because he's a product of Western civilization, and Western civilization is kind of founded on Christian ideas in which progress is so taken for granted that we don't even realise where it's come from.
It's the water we swim in,
Yes.
which is actually a phrase he used of the fact that in past ages, scientists had a belief in God and saw the universe as somehow a product of God. He said, well, that was just the water they swam in.
But I think it's more complex.
Right, exactly.
Much more complex than that. Because again, the word, one of the reasons I wanted to write Dominion, and I came to write that New Statesman article, was the realization that as I was writing about Greece and Rome, so a pre-Christian world, that the very words I was using was militating against my attempt to articulate how it was that the Greeks and the Romans saw the world, because English is a language that is saturated in Christian assumptions. Yes. There are so many words. So we mentioned religion. How shaped by Christian assumptions a word like religion is, like secular, deeply Christian. And I think that science is another word that it only comes to take on the meaning that Steven Pinker uses it in the 19th century. And it evolves in a specifically Christian context. So to use science as though it's somehow a neutral term and not one that has been, again, like so much else, shaped by centuries and millennia of Christian weathering is again, to kind of mistake just how Christian one is.
Fascinating. OK, here's a question from Jamie who says, what do you think is the biggest contemporary secular truth that is actually a Christian truth? And do you think that it's able to survive indefinitely free of its sacred moorings? So can we have the fruit eternally without the root, as if that's dying off?
Well, the one that shadows me is the concept of human rights. Where does this concept come from? It comes from the canon lawyers of the 12th century. and again, it's bred of a distinctive attempt by the medieval church to construct a body of law that will be sovereign over all the other earthly states of Christendom, so that if someone is targeted by, a king, he can appeal over the head of the king to the church. And so the canon lawyers are a product of these novel institutions called universities that are emerging over the course of the 12th century. And they are looking at the Gospels, looking at the various decrees and canons of the churches, the sayings of the church fathers, and they come to this, they say one of the key teachings in the Gospel is the idea that those who are rich should give to the poor. And, so saying that then leads to the logical conclusion that the poor have a right to what the rich are giving them. And this Catholic idea feeds down through Middle Ages, survives the Reformation, into the Enlightenment. And in the course of the 19th century, it becomes a constituent part of what various European nations are kind of construct an international framework of law, which has both Protestant and Catholic elements. So it can't be overtly Christian, because if it's overtly Catholic, the Protestants won't accept it. If it's overtly Protestant, the Catholics won't accept it. So it's constructed as being something that is just taken for granted. And of course, the 19th century is the period of imperial European hegemony. So this concept of international law then gets spread around the world. It gets inherited by the United States. It provides the kind of animating principle for the United Nations, for the Declaration of Human Rights that gets issued tellingly in Paris. And for most of my life, the heft of Western power has meant that the ideal of human rights has been able to be passed off not as being something specifically culturally contingent, not bred of a specifically Christian context, but just something that exists.
Yeah.
And I think by and large, most people who talk about human rights don't think of them as being bred of this specific context. They just think that they exist, rather in the way perhaps that people in the Middle Ages just kind of assumed that angels existed.
Sure, yeah.
But they are just as supernatural. They're just as theological a concept. And if you think about it, you can't really believe in human rights without a leap of faith. I mean, human rights don't, there's nothing you can put your hands on. There's nothing you can identify under a microscope. But where do they exist? Out there in the ether? I mean, so...
And yet Alice Roberts will defend them, I'm sure, to the hilt.
Of course.
Yes.
Of course, because she has... I mean, humanism is deeply theologically shot through. Right. And humanists are as capable of believing fantastical things as people who believe that, the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ.
So the next question is, what do you think the future is for those without the... If the Christian story is withering in people's minds, can we nevertheless hold on to these fruits that have come from it?
This is the great question. This is the great question that Nietzsche asked, and it's a question that's been sharpened by the events of the 20th century. I mean, my feeling is that we are kind of running on empty slightly, and that actually the experience of the Nazis provided the West with a new myth that, in a way, was kind of more immediately potent than the Christian myth.
Interesting.
Because what it did was to give a new incarnation for the devil. So Hitler is the devil. Yep. Auschwitz is hell. Fascists are demons. And by and large, people who are not Christian no longer refer morally to Jesus to provide the kind of lodestar for how they should behave. Instead, they look at Hitler and do the opposite.
Right.
And that's why to this day, it's a joke that you can't go on Twitter for more than 5 minutes before someone accuses you of being a Nazi.
Yeah.
I think that, but it's a highly Christian morality still, because the reason that we find the Nazis evil is because they are evil by Christian standards. So we continue to judge them by Christian standards. So I think that the potency of that is starting to fade. So maybe liberal humanism has attained enough velocity to continue on its way without the kind of the gas that Christianity had provided. Maybe. Maybe it hasn't. Maybe the Christian narrative will fade and wither in the West, and the potential for a kind of more Nietzschean approach to power, an enshrining of power, an enshrining of difference as a positive will come in. Or maybe people will kind of realise, well, actually, none of this makes any real sense without Christianity, and whether in a spirit of belief or kind of historical recognition, we'll go back to the Christian narratives.
Got an interesting one here from, I think it's Simon, who says, if you were the Sunday school teacher talking to yourself as a young boy, what would you say to yourself, your younger self? What would you do differently?
That's such a great question, because as you know, the very first conversation that I had with you and with Larry Hurtado, I talked about exactly this and said that this is always to be honest, it's always been the problem for me, is that it's not that I have an issue with the kind of the literal truth of Genesis or anything. I recognise the potency of myth and poetry that you have in Genesis, but it is the idea that I guess on one level it's considering the immensity of time, considering the immensity of organisms that have existed, the creatures that have existed, how is it possible that something that happened 2,000 years ago could be the great axle around which the wheel of the entire cosmos revolves? So that is a problem that I kind of wrestle with.
Were you actually asking that as a 7-year-old though, or was that something that was
quite those?
But something you were asking questions around dinosaurs, the Bible.
There was another thing which has actually been sharpened for me by the discovery since I was a child that the dinosaurs were wiped out by this comet.
Right.
This meteorite that hit Mexico, and I kind of why? I mean, how could God made them all? If God made them, why did He allow them to be wiped out in this appalling way? So that is a kind of it's,
and that continues to be a pressing shadow, let's say.
It's something that I ask.
Yeah.
But I guess one answer that I would give is that I certainly think it's not a coincidence that the existence of deep time, and therefore of dinosaurs, is a discovery of Christians.
Right.
Because what Christianity gives, and again, this is another example of the way in which things we may be tempted to take for granted are deeply rooted in Christian assumptions. What Christianity gives is a beginning and an end. So it gives you Genesis, and it gives you the end of days when the New Jerusalem will descend. So it gives you time as something linear rather than as cyclical. So if you live in, as most civilizations, most times, most places have done, assuming that time is cyclical, if you find things in rocks, you're not going to assume that this is an expression of a single linear framework of time. So it's no coincidence that the first person to name a dinosaur, William Buckland, who was Dean of Westminster, he was a priest as well as a geologist and a paleontologist. It's not a coincidence.
Yeah. We'll squeeze one more in before we start to just announce a couple more resources and before we go to our break. Dylan, what would you like to see the Christian church doing more of today in telling this story and also living it out? We'll keep it to about a minute, if that's all right, Tom.
Okay, well, very simple. I think that there needs to be a much greater emphasis on the stories in the Bible. I was very lucky in getting them. So I have them, and therefore when I see them in broader society, I can recognise where they're coming from for that reason. But I think that the generations that are growing up, certainly in Britain, may be true of other places as well, but certainly here, it's the first generation that doesn't have even the most basic familiarity with the most basic stories. The Exodus, or the parables or whatever. I think particularly church schools in this, which Alice Roberts again very het up about. But my issue with church schools isn't that they're forcing Christianity down people's throats. It's exactly the opposite. It's that they're not doing their job, I don't think, in giving the students a basic working knowledge of the Bible. And I don't think you have to be a believing Christian to think that that's a good thing, because without that knowledge, you cannot go on, basically, to study any of the humanities at all. You can't understand any of it. I would say that a knowledge of the Bible is as fundamental to the study of the humanities as maths is to the study of the sciences. And I think
because without it, we don't understand ourselves, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that that's why there's a kind of collapse in the study of the humanities, is that people get to A-level and have to study the Reformation or Milton, and it's absolute gibberish because they don't know what's going on.
Yeah. It's been so interesting. Thank you, Tom.